So basically like the Gen Z founders in Taiwan and also in the whole Asia. What's special to us is that we not only like invest in them, but also we try to cultivate the university students or like the youth in Taiwan to learn how to do a VC work. Taiwanese government is putting a lot of effort into fostering the entrepreneurship ecosystem in Taiwan. For example, they try to attract more talents to come to Taiwan. They have a golden card policy that basically they will give you the visa.
Hi Caleb, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Hello everyone, my name is Caleb. Konnichiwa. Nice to meet you.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hello everyone, I'm Caleb. I'm a founder of the only student VC in Taiwan, and also I'm a venture partner of a Taiwan-based venture studio that invests in startups from angel round to pre-A round.
And Caleb, here is Silicon Valley, and you are staying in here in a month, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, tell us the goal of purpose of this time.
Okay. So I think there are 3 goals for my trip here. The first goal is to find the good Asian startups to invest in, because right now we are expanding our network into Silicon Valley. And the second thing is to know the investor network here, because for our fund and portfolio companies, we are both looking for the investors here in Silicon Valley that are interested in Taiwanese startups. Or Asian startups in general. So the second thing is to establish relationships with the investors here. And the third thing is to look for connections and partners for what we are building in to help the talent cultivation in Asia, to teach and cultivate the future founders and the talents with entrepreneurship in Asia. So we are looking for the potential collaboration opportunities with the communities, with the incubators, with the investors here. We try to look for the connections that are interesting, helping to change the education and talent cultivation system in Asia. So that's like the 3 goals for my trip.
Amazing, thank you so much. So Caleb, so you have 2 organizations. One is a Taiwanese student VC firm.
Yeah.
And also you have on your venture studio,
Yes,
to support the local startup.
Yeah.
I see. So tell us more like these deep stories.
Okay. All right. So for the student VC, we are a fund with a very, very tiny fund with $300K US to invest in student startups or the founders that just graduated within 5 years. So basically like the Gen Z founders in Taiwan and also in the whole Asia. What's special to us is that we not only like invest in them, but also we try to cultivate the university students or like the youth in Taiwan to learn how to do a VC work, like how to do deal source, how do they do industry analysis, how do they do due diligence, how do they do valuation for the startups, so that they can deepen their business mindset and they can know more about what's going on in the world for the next 10 years, so that in the future they can know better about startup, know better about how to become a founder, and know better about like what the world is going on with the technology and with the business world, so that they can understand and try to like explore themselves what they want to do in their future. And also there are many people who are like want to become founders in the future. So with this approach, they can have like exploration about what's going on as a founder before they jump into this, like this hell for people. It's very hard to become a founder, and they can preview the life as a founder as a student VC. So that's the education approach that we are trying to build up for the startup ecosystem in Taiwan. So that is for the student VC part. And for this venture studio, we are trying to incubate startups and help the founders in Taiwan with our venture building approaches. So basically, we will jump into their team to become like the co-founders of the team. So we will help them with their finance, their operation, to help them find the good tractions for them, the right operation procedures for them, and we have investing like marketing agency, financial advisory agency, software agency, in order to help the founders that whether they lack like marketing talents or finance talents, we can just jump into their team to help them out, so that it's easier for them to launch a startup, and also we can help our portfolio to have better performance once we invest in them. So that's like long story short. That's like the two things that we are building in Taiwan. Yeah.
I see. Thank you, Caleb. So which did you start? Incubator, startup incubator.
Yeah.
Incubator or student VC firm?
Okay. I started the venture studio first. The story went back to my university time. So when I graduated from high school, I really want to explore the startup scenery, because I was once a founder before when I was in high school, and it was a big failure in terms of startup. So at that time, I realized that I need to boost my business mindset in order to change the world. So at that time, I decided to apply to university in the US, and I got into my first priority, but then COVID hit. Yeah, so I couldn't make it to the US, so I took a gap year in Taiwan, and then I was like participating in different startup communities and events. And later on, I met the founder of the venture studio I'm working for right now. It's called StarWorks, and at StarWorks.
StarWorks.
Yes. So at that time, they are founding the venture studio, and they are looking for talents that are interested in cultivating university students or university talents. And I was like the upcoming freshman university students. So they invited me to become their interns. So I joined their courses, I become their interns, and then later on I become their project managers, and I became their account officer. And right now I'm sitting on the venture partner role, and also a C-level role, the chief talent officer at the venture studio. So I've been working with them for 4 years right now. I'm still a senior student in university. So that's like the starting point of my VC career. Yep.
I see. Thank you so much. So running these two organizations, and how was your takeaway or something which you discovered new things in these years?
Wow.
3 years. 4 years.
Yeah, almost 4 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think I discovered a lot of things. It's just a very good learning journey for me.
Yeah.
It's also, I think for me, it's like an invisible college for me, like to work in a VC while I'm still a university student. And I think what I learned the most is the vision and also like how you view the world. Because as a VC, I got the chance to meet a lot of successful founders, investors, or like corporate leaders. I just learned a lot about how you can think of a business idea from a ecosystem perspective. Like when as an investor, you are not only asking that whether this product is a good product, whether this function is a good function, which I care about a lot when I was working as a founder. But right now, as an investor, I will ask like, why do you launch this startup in Taiwan? What is special for the Taiwan ecosystem? Is it because the semiconductors, the hardware? Why not in Japan with a bigger population? Why not in the US? Why not the West Coast in the US or East Coast in the US? There are different strengths for different ecosystems and different markets. So I think it's just like the global mindset and like the view of like how an ecosystem can benefit a startup idea. I think that's like the first thing come up with my mind for your question. But there are still many things I have discovered along the way.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So it's amazing, what can I say? Running two organizations, one venture studio and all the student VC. So both are kind of helping each other, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I have a question. Maybe many people want to ask you, as a student VC,
Yeah.
how do you get the budget, like money?
Oh, that's something I'm still worried about every single day. But I think so for now, the business model of our student VC is there are 3 ways of making money for us.
3 ways.
Yeah, 3 ways. So first of all is the management fee from the investors. The management fee.
Management.
Yeah. So basically we have $300K US dollars for our fund. So we help them invest in student startups. And the reason why they would like to sponsor us or like to give the money for us to manage is because first of all, they are all like investors from corporates or VCs, and they really face a big problem of lacking talents in Taiwan.
Lacking talent.
Yeah,
Really?
yeah. Because I think that's like the pain points for both Japan and Taiwan, because we share like the lowest birth rate in the whole world, and also like the young generation do not want to go into corporates to work anymore. They want to become founders. They want to do like as a podcaster or TikToker. Yeah, exactly. So it is a very hard time for them to look for good talents, and also they are looking for good technologies and innovations too. So our approach is to invest in to train like young exceptional students to become student VCs, and also to invest in student startups. So in both ways, they can get good talents by investing in us, because if our portfolio went successful, they can also invest or even buy the company, the startup, and also they can hire the talents that we incubate as a student VCs. So that's the first thing, the management fee. They are looking for a great talents and innovations from student founders and student VCs. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is from government. Yes. So there are more and more policies about how to cultivate young talents in Taiwan, and also how to cultivate young founders in Taiwan by the government. So there are more opportunities for us to work with the government. For example, right now we are having an entrepreneurship camp for
Camp?
Yeah, 2-day camp.
Okay.
Yeah, it's 2 days, and we invite startups that are going for IPO in this coming year, the founder of the IPO companies, to share their journey about their failure along the way. And also we invited some investors from VCs, and also from some TikTokers and YouTubers to share their journey about launching a startup, and also in investing startups, and also how to become influencer on their lives, to teach the students about like entrepreneurship, to teach them how to face failure. So that's like the 2-day camp that we are collaborating with the student with the government in Taiwan, and so they give us some sponsorship of running this event. So that's like the second thing. It's more like social impact and like fostering the entrepreneurship ecosystem. Yeah, and the third thing is working with the corporates. So there are some corporates, they want to do their employment branding to get in touch with more teenagers or like university students to gain talent. So we can help out with them to, for example, to do the marketing or promotion for the entrepreneurship context they are having, or like any like university projects they are working on. Because we are run our student VC, which is called Nova Studio, is one. Yeah, Nova Studio. Like Nova means a new star. So we are trying to cultivate and find the new star of the universe. Yeah. So Nova Studio is actually the biggest student entrepreneurship community in Taiwan, with collaboration with more than 8 entrepreneurship clubs in Taiwan. So the corporates who ever want to get in touch with those talents that are really innovative and hustling and want to like explore new things, they will come to us and they will give us some sponsorship, or they will give us some money to help them to do the marketing in university on campuses. So that's like the 3 things from us, from investors, from government, and also from corporates.
I see.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Wow. And okay, speaking of government, so Taiwanese government are publishing a kind of a new visa. It's a
golden card visa.
Please share about it.
Oh yeah. So I think Taiwanese government is putting a lot of effort into fostering the entrepreneurship ecosystem in Taiwan. For example, they try to attract more talents to come to Taiwan. They have a golden card policy that basically they will give you the visa and exclusive communities for foreigners to come, like remarkable founders, investors. They will get easy access to the visas and to like some community events, or even some like governmental run accelerators, or like some spaces that they can get for free, so that they are lower the barrier for foreigners to come to Taiwan to either invest in the local ecosystem, or like to launch a new startup in Taiwan. Yeah, so that's one of the policies. There are several policies. There are the policy that are supporting university students to launch their startups. There are policies for early stage startups investments. They have like many billion-dollar policies that are encouraging investors, VCs, to invest in startups in sustainability, in AI. Yeah, so the government is really trying hard to help the startup ecosystem to boost. Yeah.
I see. Thank you so much. Okay, next question. So this podcast concept is a startup founder's mindset. So mindset is everything, right?
Yeah.
Depends on mindset, we could change, or can do whatever, right? So that's why when we meet some people who have super positive energy, okay, like Tiffany Wang, okay, she's amazing. Maybe I can learn from her, and I want to be like her, like this influence. So this is amazing. So my goal is want to bring like you,
Yeah.
like a positive energy talent to support the startup ecosystem.
Yeah.
And then dot connecting and becoming line.
Yeah,
Line
yeah,
becomes
yeah.
a shape.
Yeah.
Anyway, so okay, so founders mindset, they wanna stay in Taiwanese market because Taiwan is a safe and good economy, right? So or they want to aim to global from day one. In Japan, most of Japanese startup founder want to be a Japan because of it's good enough size market.
Yeah.
Yeah, working with Japanese corporate already get enough money. That's why mostly they wish they could go to US market, but their mindset is not now, maybe after 10 years like this. How about Taiwanese founders
Okay.
from your perspective?
Okay. I think there will be two ways of viewing this. I think before there are many Taiwanese founders only aim at the local market because we are a market with 23 million population. So actually, it's not difficult to become like one of the top three corporates in the industries. And once you hit that amount of customers and revenues, approximately like around like $3 million US revenue, you can earn a good quality of living in Taiwan because we have like really good food. You know, we have the boba tea, xiaolongbao, and many good food, and also we have like beautiful scenery, beautiful life quality there, and the society is very safe there. So if you want to make a very comfortable life, like only build up a local based company, it will work, right? But nowadays, for the founders that really want to change the world, we are the common ground of the startup scenery in Taiwan is that the founders should go global since day one, because Taiwan is a market with 23 million population, but like compared to Japan, you have like over 100 million population, right? In the US, well, here is like over 300 million population. So I think it's Taiwan's market is big enough to feed the founders themselves. That's why we have many like family business and like small and medium size of corporates. But we don't have like unicorns or decacorns or like the tech giants that change the world. Only TSMC. Yeah. So I think for the founders that really want to change the world, we'll encourage them to think about like Japan's market or the market in Southeast Asia or the market in the US to become their end goal instead of just looking at the market in Taiwan. So I think that's the common trend right now. Yeah, so for the VCs in Taiwan, if the founders are not thinking about like going globally as their next step, most of the VC will not invest in them. Yeah. And let's just go back to like TSMC or like the success of TSMC and MediaTek. They are doing global business too. So I think Taiwanese definitely have the ability and the genetics of founding global businesses. Yeah, but it's just like we need to we want to become the support for those founders who want to thrive in the global market. Yep.
Thank you so much. I see. Great. So this time you will be here in a month. So what kind of people you want to meet? So maybe our audience also could help you. So
okay, thank you. I think I would love to meet like two kinds of people. One is any Asia-related founders or investors here in the in Silicon Valley or in Japan, because I'm visiting Japan in February, to explore the market there as well. Because we are VCs, and so our job is to look for a good deal flow, and also to look for investors to collaborate with. So definitely and I want to know more about the ecosystem here in Silicon Valley and Japan. And with my Asian background, I think any Asia-related founders or investors, either they are aiming at the market in Asia, or they are trying to establish relationship with the AI supply chain, the semiconductor industry in Taiwan, especially for any AI founders that are building physical AI, for example, or hardware for AI robotics. I think definitely Taiwan can be a good helper for you, and as an investor there, we can become your strategy investors. Yeah, so I think that's one thing, but I think that the more important connection that I want to build up is the one the Asian founders, investors, or even influencers like you, who are interested in transforming and changing the education system in Asia. Yeah, because the reason why we founded StarWorks, the venture studio, and also Nova Studio, the student VC, is to transform the Asian education system. Because in Taiwan, our education system is your elementary school, you will play sports, you will learn some music, but later on when you get into the high school, you need to study very hard to get into a good college, and then you need to study very hard to get into a good job. And if you are at the top school, you are a millionaire, you are a good talent, or either you become an engineer, a lawyer, or a doctor, or else you become a failure to the society. So I think this is a very factory style of education. So what we found out is that the youth are lacking motivation for their lives in Taiwan. There is a lying flat culture that people do not want to work hard anymore because they don't find any hope to work hard. They just want to lie flat, on their bed. They don't want to work anymore. So we really want to inspire the kids, the youth in Taiwan, to tell them that, hey, the world is very fun to play with. You can become your own. You can own your life, with the entrepreneurship spirit you have. So we really want to help the students and the youth to have their motivation, and also to teach them, cultivate them with the soft skills that are required in the AI era. For example, critical thinking skill, creativity skills, project management skill. Those are the skills that AI cannot replace, which are the skills Taiwanese students are lacking to, because we are very good at memorizing everything, which ChatGPT will do the 10 times better job than us. So we are trying to cultivate their business mindsets, the soft skills they have, for them to thrive, either as a founder, as a manager, or even a coach or influencer in their life. It depends on their motivation for lives. So that's the vision that we are building student VCs and venture studio, so that we can offer them better job opportunities in the future, and also we can cultivate their business mindset, their entrepreneurship, their project management skill, their presentation skills, and their global mindset. With our global student VCs, we will bring in speakers like Kaori, like Tiffany, and the founders from Japan, from Silicon Valley, to inspire them that, you can dream of becoming a founder or becoming a manager at a global scale, instead of just working as an engineer job for TSMC for your life. So that's the vision that we try to build through our student VC. So it's not only for finance, but for education purposes. So I'm very looking forward to connecting listeners who are in either in Silicon Valley, Japan, or either Taiwan that really care about the education system and the talent cultivation system in Asia. Yep.
Thank you so much. And speaking of the event to invite these people, so if I remember correctly, you will organize a big kind of conference
Yes.
in Taipei next year.
Yeah.
Could you please share about it?
Oh yeah, no problem. So we are having a summit called Stanford SS Summit. So right now we are collaborating with the biggest entrepreneurship club at Stanford, which is called Stanford ACES, ASES. Their mentors are like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and the CEO of Y Combinator, Gary Tan, came from that club. So the club is very influential at Stanford. So right now we are initiating a chapter of Stanford SS in Taiwan, and also they have a summit that is run by Stanford every single year in Palo Alto, and we are bringing the summit to Taiwan. So we are having the summit happening in August next year to invite the founders, investors from Silicon Valley, from Stanford, and also from the market like globally, like Japan, Singapore, Korea, to come to Taiwan. We are going to drink a lot of bubble tea, a lot of good food there, and travel around in the country, and also to bring people to visit TSMC, for example, and to mingle with the founders and investors in Taiwan to see the beauty and the ecosystem in Taiwan. And also we are bringing like the Taiwanese founders and investors to mingle with those global networks, so that the whole community can be built up in Taiwan, the global startup community. And also our focus is to bring more Asian talents, more Asian founders to come to Taiwan, so that we can talk about and discuss how we can benefit the Asian market together. Yep.
Amazing. So this big event. So, okay, lastly, do you have any pain point currently? If so, I could help you, or our audience also could help you.
Thank you so much. I think there are many obstacles that we are facing while we are having such a big vision to transform the education system in Taiwan and Asia. So I've enjoyed my life so far, like working as a venture studio and launching my own student VC as a founder at such an early age, like at 24. Yeah. But there are still like many challenges that we are facing. First of all, I would say it's like the network, like because we are trying to help the founders and talents to really have the global mindset and entrepreneurship in Taiwan. So we need more network in terms of like the network in Japan's ecosystem, the network in Silicon Valley, the people who genuinely care about the talent cultivation system, the startup ecosystem in Asia. So that's the thing. I think for me as I'm 100% Taiwanese, I'm born and raised in Taiwan. It's very hard for me to really like expand my network here in Silicon Valley and Japan. Yeah, I just found that you need to meet the right people to get into like the community, the events here. So the network is for sure the first thing, and the second thing is to look for like sponsorship or like business collaboration opportunities for our events. Like for example, for the summit, that we're still like looking for opportunities to work with the corporates or investors that are interested in like sponsoring us or collaborating with us in terms of the summit that we are having or like the student VC projects that we are doing. Yeah, so I think network and like sponsorship will be like two biggest pain points. But the third one will be like, I think like the most essential is to really have the co-founders and like the advisors or like the people who really want to join our team to support this vision to help the education system and talent cultivation system in Asia. I believe Asian talents can thrive on the global scale, on the global stage, but we really need to. It will not come out like just all of a sudden, like without any effort. So I think we need to build up the stage for those founders and talents, and that's something that I'm working hard on. So I'm really looking forward to meeting the people who share the same vision and really want to join our vision, like as an advisor, as a co-founder, as in any form. Yeah. So that's like the third thing. It will be like the co-founder or like the any sort of like collaboration opportunities for our vision. Yeah.
I see.
Yep.
Thank you so much. So I will think and I will introduce such a like people connector or key people in Silicon Valley and also Japan.
Yeah.
So and also the audience, if you are interested in talk with Caleb, please reach out. Your LinkedIn is the best place.
Yeah. So my LinkedIn is Caleb Chu, CALEB, and Chu, CHU. So feel free to contact me, the one with this jacket. Yeah, and hopefully we can connect like either online in Silicon Valley or in Japan. Yeah.
I see. Thank you so much for your wonderful story today. So yeah, and let's talk more. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Kaori, for inviting me, and thank you, Tiffany, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for the listeners. Yeah, thank you very much, and hope to see you in the future.
Yes.
Yeah, ありがとうございます。はい、さよなら。
Oh, さよなら。Perfect. Thank you so much. The three key takeaways from the conversation with Caleb. 1. Building Asia's first student VC for Gen Z founders. Caleb created Nova Studio, Taiwan's only student VC with a $300,000 fund dedicated to investing in student and recent graduate founders. Beyond capital, the program trains students in scouting deals, due diligence, and valuations, giving them hands-on VC experience, with preparing them to become a next wave of entrepreneurs. 2. Venture Studio as a co-founder partner. Through StarWorks Incubator, he and his team embed directly into startups, handling finance, operations, and go-to-market like true co-founders. This hands-on model helps young founders in Taiwan overcome talent gaps and accelerate traction, creating a stronger ecosystem for early-stage innovation. 3. Global vision, education, ecosystem, and expansion. Caleb believes Taiwan's market is too small for startups to stay local. He urges founders to aim global from day one, inspired by TSMC's global reach. His mission goes beyond investing. He wants to transform Asia's education system, moving away from factory-style schooling to foster creativity, entrepreneurship, and critical thinking. Upcoming initiatives like the Stanford ASES Summit in Taipei will connect Silicon Valley, Japan, and Asian founders to build a truly global network. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope this conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give you a like. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。チャオ。